Well, a very good afternoon or morning to you, and welcome to this presentation on technology and China. We're going to be discussing a number of issues related to this, which is really one of our most pressing problems of the day. Before, I'd just like to remind everyone that the Chicago Council for Global Affairs is a nonpartisan organization, and the views expressed today are those of the speakers and not necessarily those of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Also, a reminder that today's session is on the record, and there will be the opportunity to ask questions after our speakers have conversed among themselves for a short while. You can ask questions at ccga.live. Again, that's ccga.live. You can both type in a question and upvote questions that you already find there. Very, very, very deep thanks to the Dr. Scholl Foundation, which is sponsoring a series here at the Council on China's changing landscape. Thank you to the Foundation for making today possible. We have three distinguished contributors today. Two of them are live, and one of them you'll be able to hear a taped message in a moment. Starting with Professor Peter Cowhey, the Dean and Qualcomm Chair Emeritus of the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. Prior to his very recent retirement, he served as the Qualcomm Endowed Chair in Communications and Technology Policy. The professor also has a long career in government service, serving both at the FCC and in the office of the USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative, working on various issues having to do with communications law, international agreements, and bigness, because the word just flew out of my mind. Antitrust law, that was it. So thank you, Professor Cowhey, and very welcome. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say here. Major General David A. Harris is the Director for Integration Innovation at the Pentagon. He is the Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategy, Integration, and Requirements at the Headquarters for U.S. Air Force. Very welcome to have you. We are very happy to have you here, Major General Harris. General Harris, I believe you're a C-130 navigator, is that right? Since I won't ask the playground name, but you can tell us if you want to in a little bit. He has a long and distinguished career, both as a leader in the Air Force, as an academic, and even a leader at the Air Force Academy. So we are very happy to have you with us today to discuss these really existential issues to our nation and its security. But first, the third participant who was supposed to be with us live today is Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi of the Illinois 8th Congressional District. And believe it or not, he has chosen to be with President Biden over being with us. President Biden is in his congressional district today. And so Congressman Krishnamoorthi sends his deep apologies that he's not here live, but he did send a lovely video message, a very interesting video message about his views on competition with China and the security threat posed in some of those areas. So we're going to open by listening to and watching the Congressman's taped message.
Hi, I'm Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi from the 8th District of Illinois, and while I am disappointed I can't join you live today, I'm grateful for the chance to still participate. Thank you to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for hosting this very important discussion as it approaches its centennial celebration. I'm especially proud to join you as an alumnus of the Council's first Emerging Leaders class, and I appreciate Matt Abbott and Madeline Nicholson for helping to make this event a success. And thank you to Ivo Dalder for all of your excellent leadership. I also want to acknowledge our distinguished panelists today, Dr. Peter Cowhey, General David Harris, and Cécile Shea. As a member of the House Intelligence Committee, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of some of the threats we face in the intelligence space from the Chinese government and what we're doing to address them. Fundamentally, folks, we have entered a new era of great power competition with technology at the heart of it. We know the Chinese Communist Party is continuing its decades-long campaign of attempting to steal trade secrets as well as other technology to advance its global influence. Recently, officials in Lithuania discovered that a Chinese-made handset included a registry of terms that could be detected and censored remotely. The hidden registry allows for the censorship, again remotely, of phrases like the phrase student movement. The Chinese government already requires Chinese companies to comply with its surveillance demands, such as through the widely reported backdoor access in the equipment of Chinese tech giant Huawei. But what we know is that the threat is even greater than this. According to FBI Director Wray, the FBI has more than 2,000 counterintelligence investigations that tie back to the Chinese government, and Director Wray says they're opening a new investigation every 10 hours. Through my seat on the Intelligence Committee, I'm working to accelerate the growth as well as the safety of our technological development. For example, 5G is central to our economy, but it also presents new threats as the equipment produced by Huawei and foreign firms is not only vulnerable to attacks, but even sometimes designed to facilitate them. I've authored 2 laws to address those needs. First, I wrote the PRIZE 5G Act, which created a new incentive system for the development of our own domestic 5G sector. Secondly, I wrote the Reducing Foreign Influence in 5G Act, which initiated a U.S. intelligence community assessment of the threats posed by the adoption of 5G networks, as well as a review of the mitigation strategies to keep us safe. At the same time, we need to do even more to spur the development of new American technology. That's why I developed the Seeding Enterprises in the Microelectronics Industry Act, also known as the SEMI Act, which became law last year thanks to cooperation with my Republican counterparts. This bill authorized millions of dollars in new research grants for early stage, next generation microelectronics research in support of artificial intelligence vital to U.S. security. 2 weeks ago, this program made its first 4 grants. And that new research will help strengthen our intelligence community's computing power as we continue to face new threats on the global stage from the Chinese government. These are vital steps as we pursue the long road ahead toward greater global security and containing Chinese government's threats. Our nation can continue to lead the world in technology, but we must commit ourselves to the necessary investments to develop and protect those innovations, even as we seek to safeguard democracy here at home and abroad. Thank you again for allowing me to address you today, and best wishes for the remainder of this program.
Well, thank you, Congressman, for that sobering overview of some of the security threats emanating from a technologically advancing China. I think we can probably divide those threats into 4 areas. One is just the security of the person. How do we protect ourselves as individuals in this country from malign actors, whether state or non-state, that want to use the information that's in our phones, that's in our thermometers, that's in our refrigerators now, and the Internet of Things, that could use that information against us? Secondly, how do we protect our larger infrastructure, both the civilian infrastructure that is so reliant on the cloud and even on 5G technology now, the electrical grid, for instance, but also our military infrastructure? There's been quite a bit written lately about, could the F-35s, for instance, be susceptible to hacking? The third area of security is really the security of our society. How do we maintain cohesion? And Raj put it very well, Congressman Krishnamoorthi put it very well. How do we maintain the strength of our democracy in the face of all sorts of new types of threats in the information age? And finally, how do we maintain the strength of our economy, and how do we make sure that we can access all of the human capital in this country so that we can not just remain competitive with China, but really remain the country that the rest of the world wants to follow and wants to purchase things from? So that's kind of a tall order in a very few minutes, but Professor Cowhey, could we maybe start with you? How are we going to deal with these really intense security challenges that a technologically quickly advancing China, there we go, means for the U.S.?
Well, thanks very much for the council inviting me today. I grew up in Chicago, and it has a warm place in my heart still, living in Southern California. I think rather than try to cover all forms of security risk, it's useful to look at a couple of the examples that tend to dominate our thinking, whether it's the new 5G networks or the security of the electric grid system. And when you think about that, there is a tendency to do Maginot Line thinking. That is to say, if we just build a fixed fortification of the following specifications, it will repulse the enemy. And of course, with the original Maginot Line, the Germans decided they would just go around the line and ended its effectiveness. The same thing is true with many of the proposals for protecting cybersecurity by excluding Huawei or doing long technical mandated lists of security measures. These things tend not to work over the long term, partly because the adversary, whether public or private, is creative in responses. So the way that we now think about these problems is loosely called risk management. And risk management in cybersecurity terms means several things. First, you have to think long term, because really the deployment of the proper procedures, investments in infrastructure, human training takes a number of years and can be more robust if it's thought of over a longer time period. Second thing is, you don't assume you can wall off all threats. Instead, you accept that threats are going to penetrate the system. Instead, you invest in enormous efforts to wall off some threats and monitor for the threats that get through, have rapid response capabilities through identification, build redundancies into systems for backup and for quick restoration. Now, there are a number of other measures that go with that. But once you start to understand that there is no such thing as perfect security, then you start to understand that this is systemic management for a more secure and more resilient and responsive system once problems occur. A final point here. The nature of threats, of course, include China, but in a world that is going to become ubiquitously digital, the sources of threats are far beyond China alone. And so if you design only around threats from China, you're missing a large range of the threats that exist today, such as the examples we already see with ransomware.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We're going to come back to some of the points that you raised, but I want to give General Harris a chance to speak about his views on some of the threats. Particularly, maybe you could speak to some of the military threats that you see. I'm guessing that in your job, you war game various scenarios, and those war games have changed pretty dramatically in the last 10 years, given some of China's new technology. So what's your view on the threats from China, and as the professor said, from other locales?
You're absolutely right. The threats have changed, and our wargaming has changed significantly as well. And first, let me just say thank you for having me. This is my first time on this august Chicago Council of Global Affairs, and it's a complete honor to actually be speaking to you and to the rest of the group that's online here with us. So to your point, before we start jumping into how things have changed and what we're doing about it, maybe a little bit of a strategic scene setter. And so taking a moment to look at the strategic view, it's important to know that we're in a China, and I think you and all the rest of your viewers understand that completely. But what I don't know is if anybody's thought about what that world may look like if China were to win that global competition, what that looks like if they impose their will, their technology, and their values on this global commons that we have. So the question I ask myself is, what would it take for them to win? And I think it's exactly what they're doing right now. And that is making a heavy investment into the technology sectors that they have. Just as the previous speaker had mentioned, it's very particular investments, very targeted investments that they're doing this on. Fortunately for us, I believe for the US, innovation is the competitive advantage that we hold over the rest of China in that region. I think a combination of the diversity, entrepreneurship, even the academic institution and the global capital gives the US a real advantage over some of the areas that are being exploited right now for national security purposes. So in addition to those economic benefits that innovation creates, I think there's certain areas that we need to focus on as well. One was mentioned already, the 5G. I think quantum, bioengineering, resilient energy forms, and adaptive manufacturing are just a handful of others that we know is an important piece of our national security apparatus in order for us to maintain that competitive advantage. So with that, conversely, I'd say that for China's civil military fusion, that investment policy that they have, it's become more direct under Xi Jinping. And this really opens up an opportunity for us. Just as I said before, I think if innovation is really the way that we're going to get after this problem and allowing the US markets to do what they do, that's thriving in the commercial sector, a strong research foundation in our universities, flexible financial systems that we have. The last thing that we want to do is have a top-down approach over this and take the approach that China has. I think our strength is really allowing those markets to flow and allowing those technologies to flourish under some of these things like our venture capitalists that we have that are out there and the investments that they're making in some of these key and critical capabilities. I'll just give you one example. If you take a look at the work that Tesla has done with electric cars and the small business Lighten and their work on the next generation lithium sulfur batteries, there's opportunities here for the military to partner with the commercial sectors onto these for a military advantage into this. So letting those industries flourish and not having a top-down approach, again, I believe is going to be a key part of our success over China in this competition. Finally, let me just say, it is an honor to talk about the future of technology with you and the rest of the group that's on here. What I've noticed, I've done a little research as well, and the University of Chicago has over 100 Nobel laureates. That's amazing. That is absolutely amazing in my mind. You know, as a graduate from the University of Alabama, I'm pretty proud of the dynasty that Dr. Bell, Greg Byrne, and Coach Saban have made over Alabama and the football team over the past 100 years, but it's not 100 Nobel laureates. So congratulations to the University of Chicago on that one. And much like the work that they have done in order our academic institutions to further a lot of this progression in the commercial sector, we look forward to the thought and the work that this forum is doing, this council is doing to drive us in the right ways. Thanks.
Thank you very much, General. Professor Cowhey, there's a report out today with some pretty shocking figures on internet availability in the rural South. I think it's at 38% of African Americans in the rural South have no internet in their homes. 26% couldn't even get internet in their homes if they wanted it or could afford it. 23% of whites in the rural South have no internet in their homes. And if you were to go into the Midwest, in small towns in the Midwest, you would find, in my experience, very similar figures, a lack of penetration by high-speed internet and really limited availability of good cell phone service. I run little tests and I stop in downtowns of various towns throughout the Midwest, and I see if I can get T-Mobile or AT&T, and it's shocking how often I get zero. So there may be one provider providing services there, but in some of those towns, there's no provider providing services. So can we compete technologically with this kind of economic disparity in this country where you have urban areas, particularly the wealthier neighborhoods in urban areas with outstanding access to technology, and children in other parts of the country with no access to Zoom, employers with no access to Zoom or to the internet? What are we going to do about this kind of inequity?
Well, it's one of those great questions that show that simply spending money doesn't always lead to success. Let me try to break down the list of conditions that you've described into three buckets. The first is our ability to compete in advanced technology. And there we are, as the general said, in relatively good shape, although China is closing fast. The most important thing that we've done in the early Biden administration is to up the budget for fundamental research. The US has declined from about 3% of our gross domestic product going to research through the federal government to less than 1%, while China has headed the exact opposite way. And we have to reverse that budget commitment if we're going to keep leadership. We also have to keep the US open to the best researchers in the world coming to both be educated and then stay and work in our laboratories and be partners. And most foreign researchers who are of top talent who are offered jobs in the US elect to stay, contrary to the notion that they all go home. Now, the second tier to this problem is really the tier of equity that you've referred to, which is simply what is doing right by our citizens. And the third tier is the question of, if you would, innovation at the applied local level. So let me tackle both of those briefly. We have spent an enormous amount of money in bipartisan public policies over decades on supposedly covering that gap on connectivity in rural areas and for low-income people. There are large funds to subsidize service, both by building out infrastructure and by subsidizing the bills of low-income communities. It still has not, as you've pointed out, fully succeeded. Part of the problem is one that, oddly enough, is that in these low-income rural areas, the incentive to build infrastructure is low, and that tends to lead to rural telecom carriers being the predominant investment companies, and they are very conservative on infrastructure investments, even with large public subsidies. And trying to unlock that puzzle is one of the preeminent problems facing the Biden administration today, as it has in prior administrations. The other side to that problem is a surprise, which is many low-income people, it turned out when we did careful survey research in the past, thought that, if you would, broadband was a luxury they didn't need. And what COVID revealed to everyone was that is not true, and that it's a fundamental need. And so there's been a recalibration about the urgency of the problem that I hope will lead to some innovation in policy. Finally, to apply digital innovation. Again, the theme that you raised at the beginning of this program, that everything, including your thermometer, is becoming digital, is exactly right. And that is both the opportunity and the challenge. The possibility that even the most traditional forms of economic activity, farming, for example, are becoming increasingly digital in their organization and structure, means that the ability of local expertise, the people who are farmers, for example, to be innovators in the digital world is opening up, but giving them the tools and creating the opportunities for them to do so is one of the big challenges. There's a lot of money going now into funding these regional innovation hubs. They are experiments. We're going to have to learn how to do it right. If we can, as you suggested, it will be a big boost to our long-term competitiveness.
Thank you very much. I wonder if we could talk, we've been talking about some of the threats from a rising China and other countries that are also gaining new technology. But what about some opportunities? One of our emerging leaders, Congressman Krishnamoorthi, mentioned that he was an emerging leader 2 years ago. We had a wonderful emerging leader named Dan Mishap, a graduate of the Naval Academy, who did a very good project stating we risk our own future, not to mention our national security, when we don't at least try to cooperate with China in some areas. And he specifically spoke about alternative energy development, which really stalled over the last 5 years because Congress doesn't want to fund some of the joint programs that we were working on. Are there areas where we can and should be cooperating more directly and being willing to accept some of the risk because it's just too important to our future, and because it will allow us to maintain ties so that if things improve in the future, we will have those relationships at least at the working levels? And I'll let either or both of you respond to that.
Well, if General Kelly wants to take the lead on which technologies he considers so essential as not to cooperate on very extensively, maybe I can talk about the broader gambit of technologies after that.
Okay. So how about that, General Harris? You know, it's your job to worry about the worst case scenarios. So what technologies are just too important to your ability to do your job and to the United States' ability to maintain its security that we really need to think twice and even 3 times about levels of cooperation?
So that's an interesting question. I think that let me approach it in 2 different ways. First, just maybe an indirect approach, and that is so we heard a little bit before about the money side of this and the importance of being financially invested into our science and technology and our research and development side of the house. But it has to go towards a purpose, and those monies going to what? I had mentioned a few before, and that was 5G. Quantum is a big piece that I think is going to be important for all of us down the road, and specifically with the military application of it. Energy and becoming less reliant on the liquid fuels and alternative energy sources, I think, are another piece that technology plays a key role. And I think there needs to be a certain amount of independence that we have, both on whether it's alternative sources, what have you. Those are important pieces, I think, for the US to be focused on as we look at the rising cost of some of those bills for us. Because what we're doing is it's becoming a cost imposition strategy to the US on this. So money is an important piece of this and what we invest in. Right now, as we had alluded to earlier, the Department of Defense, the entire budget to include DARPA, our research, our defense research program, is about 1.5%, and that needs to grow. I think if you look at any conflict in the interwar periods, one of the things you need to do is invest in S&T and RDT&E, and specifically critical areas, like I mentioned before, of what's going to move the needle. If you look before Desert Storm, we did it in precision. Instead of dropping 100 bombs to hopefully have one of them hit a target, you have one bomb per target. So that precision piece of this was very important. I think there's going to be aspects of this within our Space Force that are going to need to look at alternative sources of energy, alternative sources for precision navigation and timing. Those types of things I think are going to be important for us in the future. But you didn't mention a part about cooperation. And so let me just touch on that a little bit. There are things that we need to do with our partners. Our partners have experience, our allies and partners have experiences in a lot of different other technologies that we quite frankly just don't have the money or commitment to be able to put into it. Whether it's new types of command and control systems that are out there, manned, unmanned teaming of manned platforms, unmanned platforms, the Brits, the Australians, the Swedes, the Finns, they have a lot of different technology aspects out there that we could really learn a lot from. It's not just them learning from us. So I think from my point of view, the things that would give me pause and keep me up at night, I would say are the quantum aspects, the computing pieces of this. 5G, as you mentioned before, is a big part of that, being a little bit more energy independent. And then finally, as I look to the future, it's where do we get a lot of our things that we rely on today, the things that make the components for an iPhone, for example, and the technological components that go into that, being more self-reliant, I think is going to be the piece that we need to focus on. Thanks.
And I just want to be sure I understand what you said. When you said 1.5%, are you speaking of the DoD budget, that you think the R&D section of the DoD budget needs to grow?
It does, yes. So right now it's 1.5%. That's the DoD acquisition budget that goes into S&T and then research and development.
So it's 1.5% of their acquisition, not of their personnel budget.
Of the entire acquisition budget, yes.
Of the entire acquisition budget, which for the Air Force is huge and for the Marine Corps is less huge, right?
Yeah,
so
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So it is on relative scale based on the number of people per service. But
right.
Overall, when you start looking at the amount of money that we put back into science and technology or research and development, that part needs to grow in order for us to be competitive in the future.
Makes sense. Thank you very much. Okay, Professor, he doesn't want to cooperate with China on very much, it sounds like. So what is your take on this?
Well, I largely agree with what General Harris said on priorities. We may differ on a couple of specific items, and I last year headed a bipartisan expert group that spent a year delving into this issue. And at the top of our list for where the U.S. had to stay ahead and where the use of export controls to help reinforce our research and competitive juices was vital, was semiconductors. That is the key to leadership in quantum computing in the long term. And it's also the key to artificial intelligence leadership in the long term. And it's spreading over to areas like biomedical sciences. So if I had to name one area, that is the place where we should be both investing and protecting very, very carefully. Now, whether or not that means that we should be restricting the export of technology in every aspect of semiconductors is a different question. And that leads to the larger issue that, in fact, the US and China are linked in a global knowledge and innovation system that isn't neatly separated and will not assume the dimensions of the classic Cold War. It can't. You know, on your iPhone, the Gorilla Glass that protects that phone was invented by Corning, but the practical engineering to figure out how to actually make it work was done by subsidiaries in China working with local suppliers. And that is the pace of the future. And when you look at world economic growth in the next 10 years, the rough estimate is that about 30% of total global economic growth will be generated out of China, which is descending in its rate of growth, but still formidable. And the Pacific as a whole will constitute 50% of that growth. And that world is going to be one where Chinese technology and US technology are going to coexist. And so we have to have rules about what are our priorities for technological protection that are realistic with the fact that our firms have to be living in a world of coexistence at a practical grassroots level. Now, the other point I just make here is that there are areas that we should distinguish the diversification of production capabilities and the diversification of discovery capabilities. Energy is typified by battery technology advances. There's no reason why battery technology advances should be classified or walled off from each other. The advantages for the world and for our individual economies are too great from rapid advances. But diversifying production capabilities, as the general suggested, is something that can be part of a balanced strategy for supply chain resilience. And we should be thinking in those sorts of terms.
So I think that's, for instance, I don't think that we can make progress in preparing for the next pandemic without working with the most populous country in the world, right? And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't also be able to make our own masks.
That's exactly
Okay, thank you very much. So we have quite a few questions here, and I'm going to ask the one that's been the most upvoted, and it goes to you, General Harris. What of the many Chinese military technological advancements that have occurred very quickly over the last 10 or 15 years? I remember being at PACOM, and we didn't think China was interested in getting an aircraft carrier, and we clearly were wrong, right? So which ones are the most concerning to you? Or you want to even be more broad about that? What ones do you think are the most concerning to your colleagues across all the services?
I don't know if it's a technology piece or not. I think it goes back to what we just spoke about, and that was the production capability. I think it's the large workforce that they have, their ability to mass produce it. And when you have a government that's over top of a lot of your companies and they can have that direct interaction with them and then drive the timelines to a pace that we haven't seen before in a long time about their ability to produce them at set mass and scale to compete with us, that's concerning. They always say that mass is a quality all of its own. This production piece that China is capable of doing and their abilities to put technology, engineering aspects into their mass production is quite concerning. The other piece of this, when you start looking at it, is they can adapt very well to new technologies on onboarding, and how they use them, how they leverage them, and make them their own and using them in their own way is another piece that's concerning to me.
Interesting. So Professor Cowhey, the general mentioned just the size of the population, and I happened to be in Taiwan during their last election. They had 1.5 million conscripts that they could employ on misinformation against a relatively small country. And that brings up a whole other issue that we haven't spoken of yet, which is kind of security and dealing with this topic of misinformation. You did talk about needing a long-term plan of educating our own citizens about how to deal with technology. We don't seem to have done a great job of that over the last 10 or 15 years. But do you have any thoughts on how we should be educating not just our children, but also our adults in dealing with these kinds of massive psychological operations that a number of countries now are capable of mounting against us and our friends?
Well, it's a great question to which I don't have a great answer. That said, let me go back to history. In the late 19th century, we had the conjunction of the introduction of the telegraph and of something we've long ago forgotten, which is the steam-powered printing press, which changed the way that we could produce newspapers rapidly en masse, so that you had multiple dailies in every population center with several editions per day. And that led to a new era of gossip, and not gossip that was just local, but was national. And it created a crisis of what was fair comment in the American Republic at the time. And eventually we sorted it out, but it took a long time to figure out an imperfect solution, which are libel laws and other safeguards. So I don't think we're going to come to any particular fast solution here. That's the first point. My second point is just about starting points. One thing we know from cognitive psychology is that first information in low information environments where you don't know much is really important, because it kind of anchors how you hear everything else. So what we need to do is be much more proactive at the beginning of times that we can identify as ripe for misinformation, an election season, the beginning of a pandemic, for example, with good information flooded as a conscious public education campaign from top to bottom, from senior leadership to grassroots, in order to establish that anchor first information. You won't stop misinformation after that, but it changes how people hear information after that. I think that that's something that the military has long achieved in boot camp along the way, if I understand my colleagues in the military.
It's interesting you say that, because it is true that the first thing that you hear about a topic is what you remember. Certainly learning languages, and when you learned it the wrong way the first time, it can be very, very difficult to change it back to the right way. I've certainly learned that in my life. Thank you. That was very interesting. General, did you have anything that you wanted to add to the issue of misinformation? Or
I think right now, when you look at China, they've had 20 years to take a look at how we've conducted war and what that's looked like in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq. And I think what it really needs to do is they see the amount of information we need and how much information we consume and use. And I think that's really where China is moving when it comes to their forces and what they want to do. So this part about what you learn first and how it's reinforced over time is really important. And I'll tell you, it's also difficult when you're trying to change an organization with a new way of warfare to unlearn some of the ways that we've done things in the past and try to adapt using new technologies. One of the things we find in wargaming a lot is if we introduce a new concept, technology, it's hard to take a current day operator and put them in the role of a place that's 15 years down the road, because we're employing manned unmanned teaming. They tend to use it the same way that they would fly today versus how would you fly with this tomorrow in this new technology. It's relearning some of those skill sets that we still struggle with. And I think that's just a human nature problem, not a China-US problem.
Interesting. Thank you. I want to come back to that, but we have another really interesting question for both of you, probably more for the professor. What advice would you give American companies that want to compete globally and may need a presence in China, but also want to be security conscious? And I would just add, and also want to be ethics conscious, because that increasingly is also a huge challenge for companies operating in China.
Right. Well, I know that when CEOs gather, these are the sorts of topics they're spending more and more time on. And I don't think they have perfect answers to it. Let me deal with a little bit of the security problem as an example of the first dimension. The leading edge technology companies of the United States that operate in China tend to have research centers in China, but those research centers have a carefully defined program of localization and adaptation for local conditions, and not so much involved in the core, if you would, technology treasures of the company. They also operate with a second premise that goes back to this notion of risk management, which is in the long term, there's no technological knowledge that is perfectly secure on a large basis. And so having to invest in accelerated innovation in their key technology differentiators is part of the cost of being in China. We tend to forget in this discussion about disentangling our two economies that there are over 1 million jobs of American workers that depend on our exports to China. Our trade levels remain extremely high, and American firms that are not on the excluded list in China, which is a number of our key technology companies, are often doing quite well in China. But they are operating in a sense as quasi-autonomous operations that are localizing in the way they use their technology, the workforce, and their practices. That leads to your question about ethics. And that's a very hard problem, because your presence in China is like many presences around the world, not easy to be turned around in the profile of production or other factors quickly. So you tend to take the biggest high risk, if you would, most odious examples and focus on those. And there's a lot underneath that that still remains to be done. And the real question that we should be asking companies is, after you get done with the top tier, what's being done with the much larger tier below that?
Interesting. Yeah. And especially now, as we see, just the intrusiveness of the government and how it deals with its own citizens, at some point, companies are going to be asked to take a stand on how their employees are treated. Um, Thank you. So, General, you said something about people not wanting to adjust to a new way of doing things, for instance, pilotless vehicles. And that led to a controversy between some of the military organizations right now, which points to a bigger problem. There has been enormous credential inflation in our society over the last 30 years. Jobs that 30 or 40 years ago didn't even require a high school degree, suddenly now you see employers requiring master's degrees, bachelor's degrees. Some services say you need to be an officer to fly a drone. Some services say you can be an 18-year-old straight out of boot camp and fly a drone. Are we losing a huge percentage of the human capital in our country by restricting certain jobs and career paths to people who happen to either be able to or want to go to college? Do we need to be more inclusive and do a little bit more like the Israelis and look for talented 18 and 19-year-olds and let them at it?
So there is definitely a culture aspect of what you just said, and that is, and to be clear, I think that it's not that the pilots don't want to adapt. I think sometimes trying to put yourself in the mindset of how would I use that is just a leap, very big leap from what they're used to training to every day. But to your point about cyber and some of the other people recruit from the population, specifically when it comes to tech and how do we look at ourselves internally, culturally, those are big pieces of what makes us as a military. The way we've done things in the past, the use of cyber, and it doesn't need to be an officer or enlisted, or can I recruit somebody that's 18 years old or 19 years old right out of high school and put them right into the force? And I think we're coming up with better ways. We have a lot of work to do, just to be candid. We have a lot of work to do when it comes to looking at how do we refocus, how do we recruit differently, and then how do we hire those types of professionals into the military, specifically the ones that have a patriotic sense of duty or the ones that want to serve, even if it's for a short period of time, where we can then incentivize them, give them some of those credentials while they're in the military, and then go on to jobs in the market. Because again, it's this partnership with industry that we need to continue to nurture and harvest.
Thank you. Professor, you come out of an organization that has benefited by credential inflation. So what do you think? Are we missing out on too many people who might actually be able to participate in the economy more fully?
I think the answer is yes, but I would break the phenomenon we're seeing down into a couple of pieces at least. There are a lot of fields, data analysis is a good one, where your credential had to be in computer science or related technical degrees. And nowadays, the entry position is really much broader in the credentialing that goes into it. People are looking, if you would, for people who have some basic math skills and an ability to see how to logically organize data and see patterns in data. And so in that sense, credentialing has become broader and more universal, but that's at the college level and above. Below that level, I think, is the real challenge. And I don't have a perfect solution for this, but the evidence about job training programs is pretty mixed. But what is clear is that in some countries, the economic system of tax incentives works for firms to spend much more time on workforce training because there are generous economic incentives for investing in the workforce. And in the US, that return off of investing in the workforce is much lower on a practical day-to-day basis. And if I had to choose one place to start working on the problem, I would do that. And my suspicion is that the junior college system and a variety of other methods will start to respond to that. So that'd at least be one wedge into the issue that you're raising.
Well, you provided a perfect closure to this time, because it turns out that Congressman Krishnamoorthi couldn't be with us because he was at a junior college with President Biden, touting President Biden's attempts to make community college free for all those who need it or want it. So how about that? And it is exactly 12:45 on top of it. I cannot thank both of you enough for being so generous with your time and educating us on this really important issue. I wish we had another couple hours. We have so many more things that we could speak about. I wish you all the best. Professor, I wish you the best in retirement. You don't seem very retired, frankly. And General, thank you for your service, and please thank all of the men and women working for you for their service and for their commitment to keeping us safe and secure, not just today and tomorrow, but 30 and 40 years from now. So thank you to both of you, and for all of you who are tuning in, we hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.